Hello, and welcome to Africa at the G20, the podcast where we explore how African voices, priorities, and leadership can shape global governance spaces. I'm your host, Raisa Cole, Climate Governance Lead at Democracy Works Foundation. In today's episode, we turn our focus to the Foundation's 20 recommendations, a set of proposals designed to strengthen the role of philanthropy, civil society, and governments in shaping a just, inclusive, and sustainable global economy. To us and to provide your insights on kind of the F20 recommendations and what they mean within an African context, and because of your work with C40, what they mean within an African urban context, in the kind of time we find ourselves in with rapid urbanization and climate change almost coming together to shape Africa's future in a way that we've never seen before. So I'm really excited to have you here, and maybe you can introduce yourself a little bit and maybe talk about the work that you're doing with C40 across Africa.
Perfect. Thank you, and lovely to be here. Quick introduction. My name is Zarina Moolla. I am the head of climate action implementation for the Africa region for C40. And I basically am working currently with 7 African cities to implement their climate action plans. So you may have heard that all the African cities that are part of C40 have developed climate action plans, which outline a pathway for them to achieve climate resilience, net zero carbon, and inclusivity by 2050. And what this program that I'm working on does is really working with these cities to implement these climate action plans, focusing on 2 main areas. One is around governance and mainstreaming. So how do we ensure that climate change is integrated into city policies, processes, and plans? And the other one is to work with them through a process of implementation. So we're working in the waste and energy sectors, and we're looking at how we can work with cities and collaborate with external stakeholders to implement 2 actions in their climate action plan in waste and energy.
Obviously, the work that you're doing speaks to kind of all of the F20 recommendations. But I wanted to just start with the first one, and that's on kind of just energy transitions and this call for a just and inclusive transition to renewable energy. Is there anything within the kind of C40 work in African cities that speaks to that? Particularly in terms of linking mitigation efforts to kind of adaptation priorities. It's something that we're seeing a lot in our work in Democracy Works Foundation is that, African communities and governments are kind of increasingly averse to have the mitigation conversation without it being deeply embedded within an adaptation agenda. So how are you kind of linking the 2 spaces, if at all, in the work that you're doing?
That's an excellent question, and it is something that's coming up time and time again with African mayors. And the biggest ask is, especially given that one of C40's priority areas is the phasing out of the ending of fossil fuels. One of their biggest asks is, if Africa didn't really cause the problem, why should that be the focus? And our need in Africa is adaptation, and adaptation is critical across all our African cities on various platforms. I think the messaging in C40 is that the phasing out and end of fossil fuels is critical to ensure that we meet the climate change targets and we don't go beyond, the negative and extreme events that we're already experiencing now. And I think we're seeing that the mayors are understanding that, but they are calling for inclusive and just transition processes in how we address energy. In the South African context, I think it is very clear, especially given that South Africa is very coal-based and our emissions is very high from the energy sector. In the other countries, however, cities like Nairobi, Addis Ababa, where we dominantly hydropower or geothermal power, it tells a different story. So we have to think about our energy transition being providing access, providing energy equality and equity, and really focusing on where the people need the energy. Informal settlements is areas that we're working on very closely, looking at decentralized systems and microgrids to provide the solution. And in that way, we're also generating or trying to unlock economic opportunities at a small scale level, creating local jobs, building local charging capacities, looking at how we can provide support for energy access in areas where it just never was. We're working in a market in Lagos where there was no lighting. And suddenly, through projects that we're working on, there's solar power lighting, and people can, do their day-to-day activities and have the security that they need. So I think in a lot of the African context, we want to look at where there's a specific need. Adaptation plays a big role, especially in cities where we're dependent on geopower, hydropower, and the forecast and the prediction show that is at risk. And so the sustainability is an issue. And they're seeing that for sustainability of energy, they need to switch to renewable and alternative measures. Increased rainfall patterns, we've seen where there's flood and people are no longer on the grid. There's really a need to move to these solutions. And because they are becoming cheaper and they're becoming more reliable, we're seeing that there's also a growth in private sector engagement in the space, and linking city priorities with economic development and, having clear financial models and business models to develop these things has been where we are seeing a bigger unlock in the transformation and the transition.
I really like the kind of narrative that you drew around renewable energy being a more kind of agile and resilient model of energy provision, kind of within this increased climatic uncertainty. You mentioned some of the, or kind of touched on the kind of next question, which is around risk framing in Africa. And this is something that we've asked kind of everyone that we've spoken to. And I think it's particularly relevant to cities, and how cities are kind of defining climate risk. But also how kind of external actors or how the financial sector kind of defines risk within Africa, how that affects funding value chains into kind of climate change action. And so can you speak a little bit about kind of how risk is being defined across urban centers on the continent? And I know that this is the work that you're doing every day, all day. But yeah, it would be good to kind of understand whether there's been a kind of transformation in that space, like how people are thinking and talking about risk, and how that kind of narrative around risk can be communicated to funder organizations and even philanthropies, to ensure that there's kind of funding flowing where it's most needed.
That's a very good question. And I'm going to start with the confession. My program at the moment is very mitigation focused. And what is interesting about that is when we secured this funding with the funder, they requested that we focus on mitigation. And I think the funders initially, and I'm seeing a change, initially wanted mitigation projects more because there's clear payback periods, there's clear return on investments. They can link it to economic growth, and they can link it to, for example, if you're getting development funding, they can see how that can link to long-term development. But what is interesting about that is, as C40 as an organization is seeing a shift in funding interest from mitigation to integrating adaptation and mitigation, as you said earlier, or just funding adaptation programs. And I think the story that they are seeing is, firstly, the science is clear now. The evidence is clear that, we are reaching a tipping point and we need to act fast. And if we don't, the impacts are going to be far greater. They're not investing anything now, and there'll be nothing to invest in the future. So we're seeing that funders are increasing their realization that climate risk is something that is key on the radar. We're seeing it in the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report year on year. But as cities, I think mayors are shouting on the rooftops that climate adaptation is critical. And, we need to really focus on loss and damage, and we need to ensure that global funders are providing funding for adaptation. And that change is apparent now. It's not at the scale that we need it, and we need very high levels of funding. If you look at the amounts, I don't know, there's this bubble of amount of funding that's grant funding linked to mitigation and adaptation. The adaptation bubble is so tiny that it needs to really, really scale up. And I think the motivation there is around the statistics that we're seeing on the costs of these intense events, heavy rainfall events, increased flooding events, and how those costs are having trickle-down effects to private sector, to economic development, to growth, and to just sustainability in our cities. So I don't think I have a clear answer for you on how risks has been perceived in our cities. All I can say is through our work and through our engagement with cities and with mayors, we are seeing a more cross-cutting interdepartmental recognition that climate change is here and the impacts are here, and it's now being integrated not just into environmental departments, but into finance departments, into planning departments, into other departments where climate change before was just something that environmental people do. It's now something that all sectors are aware of, and they're increasingly considering the impacts. For example, stormwater planners, engineers are saying, let's design bigger stormwater drainage. Those sort of things are becoming very much more apparent than they were before.
Focus as Democracy Works Foundation, we focus a lot on kind of the mainstreaming work. So meeting climate and broader developmental priorities, and positioning climate governance as just a moment or an opportunity to kind of address the broader governance issues. And in my work in particular, I focus a lot around kind of cities and how that sort of climate governance frameworks are deeply embedded within the broader governance frameworks and reflective of those broader governance frameworks. And that then calls for the necessity to have that kind of intersectional approach and kind of have that mainstreaming approach, so that it's not just like the climate scientist nerds who are sitting in a room talking about this very scary, risky thing, but it becomes like a material reality for other departments, whether it's health or education or housing. Yeah, I'm not sure how much of your work focuses on kind of adaptation financing, and those kinds of financing value chains. But yeah, obviously that kind of intersectional approach, or that kind of bringing together broader issues with climate change, is a strategy to funnel funding into the adaptation space, and obviously to safeguard the investments that have been made in development, and the gains that have been made over the last kind of 30 years. And so we're also doing a lot of like framing of the conversation around these kind of, investment in adaptation as almost a safeguard of development gains. But maybe what would you say are some of the kind of adaptation funding priorities that you are seeing, or what are some of the kind of barriers that you're seeing in terms of adaptation finance? And what are cities calling for across the continent?
So I think the biggest barrier is it's not very tangible. Adaptation does not have clear indicators. It's not very easy to monitor progress. As I said before, it's not something that has very clear, easy to calculate ROIs and payback periods like you would with the mitigation project. And because of that, I think funders are a little bit wary of putting money in something where it's not very clear what the impact is upfront, and it's a long-term investment. With mitigation, you come in after 2 years, you get your payback period. It's a very clear impact story to tell. Whereas adaptation is, I mean, some of it is very clear, but some of it is, it's still exploratory. It's very wide from, water issues to heat to flooding to, it's just, it's very wide. It does not have clear indicators. It's not easy to track progress. I think in a nutshell, that is the biggest sort of barrier to adaptation finance. And I think it also touches to the point that, it's not profitable. So you really, the key need for adaptation and the people that are impacted the most from an adaptation perspective are the poorest, are the most vulnerable. So it becomes an equity and equality issue that needs to be discussed as well. And then I think that just becomes a big barrier to address adaptation in our cities. In terms of what cities are calling for is just generally a need for stronger national and intergovernmental agreement on loss and damage. I think that's the biggest thing on the agenda. And for that to be very local government led and local government address, like, local government and cities. And then when it comes to the specifics in our African cities, there's a big need for support in the water sector, both from a flooding perspective, but a water security perspective. And it's got to do with the combination of the story of aging infrastructure, but also because climate change is exacerbating that. And then the flooding linked to waste. So along these systemic integrated issues is a big thing in our cities. And then now, increasingly, interestingly, the link between biodiversity and heat and the response for heat mitigation measures and linking that to biodiversity and flooding is something that we're seeing more. I think that's gaining more traction, and we're seeing a lot more commitment and investment in that space. But it's also something that is critical. And then I think lastly, the data. At the moment, our cities, to do a climate risk assessment is costly. We don't have capacity in our cities. Some cities, there's one person working on climate change with no budget to do that. So a lot of the time, the funding would come in, but they want to fund infrastructure projects at a large scale, whereas sometimes we just need a person on the ground and some technical assistance to do a very good climate risk assessment that's linked to finances and tells a good story to have a project pipeline for adaptation. So I'm all over the place, but I think project pipelines is a big one. Clear, direct data to inform risk assessments, and then big finance, loss and damage sort of funding on a global level to support. And I think loss and damage is one, but I think we also need to be proactive to try and implement measures to avoid loss and damage. I think loss and damage is a bit like accepting that the problem is going to happen and we just have to pay to recover, but really the finance before to ensure that we're building resilience and we're ensuring that the damages that we do incur is going to be much less than what has been forecast.
I mean, I think a lot of these things are coming out of the conversations that we're already having within our kind of member meetings, and this kind of a role of philanthropy in terms of kind of acting as a bridge, unlocking certain financing value chains, de-risking certain investments, and then definitely creating this pipeline. And that's been something that's coming out really strongly, is this kind of a role that they can play in kind of developing these proof of concepts. And yeah, I really like the very kind of targeted list of things that cities want or are calling for. It's very useful, particularly your comments on kind of climate risk assessment. And I think there was almost like a wave of that with 100 resilient cities and the work of like Rockefeller, and then it kind of took a dip. And I think because obviously with risk assessment, it has to be dynamic and it has to be evolving. And with a changing climate, we have changing risks all the time and increase kind of levels of unpredictability. So yeah, I feel like it's definitely an area that philanthropy should be looking at, is like this kind of long-term investment in risk assessment and understanding kind of risk better. And obviously exploring like risk assessment from a very localized kind of sociocultural embedded way. Because I think a lot of the kind of risk frameworks are also kind of just borrowed and applied into Africa. And so that gives me kind of a segue into, yeah, the risk question again, I guess, but how maybe a call to action or some sort of statement that you'd like to make, just maybe in closing, around kind of how Africa cities are adapting to climate risk, and the kind of support that they need, not just in terms of finance, but what is needed both within and from the kind of broader global community to support Africa through navigating climate risk.
So I don't think this is going to be an impactful comment, but something that has been bugging me for a very long time is the fact that there's a lot of philanthropic organizations. There's a lot of, DFI funding. There's a lot of, international finance out there. Everyone is doing something, but what I think we need to think about more is how do we coordinate across these different organizations, institutions, and strategically work in these cities to see how we can develop scalable, transformative impact solutions. So for example, this is just an example. In Nairobi, you'll have the WRI, you'll have us, you'll have WWF, you'll have UN Habitat, you'll have World Building Council, all working on very similar initiatives at a small scale. And then it's like, it's not getting us to push that envelope, because we're all doing these small projects and not really able to use our funding to get large scale impacts. So if we coordinate better, align better, have a long-term goal where everybody is coming in to get that long-term impact, I think that could help transformative change in African cities. Secondly, I think Africa is ready right now. I think we're seeing a lot of innovation from Africa, African solutions. I think African small, decentralized solutions are coming up more and more. And I think we need to harness them. We need to look at how we can replicate them. And we need to look at, instead of driving solutions from the global north and from other regions, really looking at how Africa can learn from each other and adopt solutions that address the African context. And I think we're seeing this more, but I think there is some support for these different organizations to really look at how we can build that network of African solutions and innovation. And then lastly, I think you mentioned it earlier, but really looking at how we can get AI to drive impact, provide the database, unlock challenges that we face, especially in informal sectors and vulnerable communities. Like with one cell phone, you can make such a big difference. And we need to really harness those sort of solutions to drive big change. And I said lastly, but I think the probably last one is really looking at the bigger picture from the international community and trying to come out with one voice on what we kind of need and have strong leaders to push that one voice. Sometimes I feel like African leadership is missing, and without that strong leadership, we're not going to move and progress as much in that space as we need to.
Okay, thank you so much. I think, yeah, it's been really interesting, obviously, to speak with you, just because I think Africa is almost like the frontier of adaptation, of global adaptation, and almost for the last 10 years, a lot of those innovations have come from the continent and have been tested on the continent. So maybe just in closing, could you tell us about just one kind of lesson that you think African cities can teach global networks of cities from around the world?
That's a very good question. I mean, I think African cities have done a really great job of co-creation and community ownership and community engagement. So whilst we're always calling for national level engagement and looking at these bottom-up approaches from a city level, I think African cities is also doing a great job of looking at community level engagement. And I think for us to achieve that impact, and everyone says it's everyone has to be on board, it's an all of society approach. African cities has been driving that, ensuring that communities have a voice, ensuring that they are part of the solution. In the work that we do, we really ensure that the communities that we're engaging with are informed and they provide their perspectives and are supportive of what we do, but also provide ideas and solutions. And I mean, I think if we really want to improve resilience in our cities, that is something that African cities can share with the rest of the world in terms of improving and increasing equality and equity in our climate change transition.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Zarina. Zarina will be our keynote speaker at our Governing Sustainability session in the F20 Climate Solutions Forum happening from the 27th to the 28th of May this year. Thank you so much, Zarina. I really appreciate your insights and your knowledge and just your feelings and reflections on the F20 recommendations, but also just like climate realities in African cities.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful talking to you. Have a good day.